Good morning. I want to invite you to Matthew chapter 18, if you'll open there, please. Matthew chapter 18. I want to say a couple things to kind of set this chapter in context. We're going to look at just a small portion of the chapter, but I want us to appreciate the beauty of it in terms of the things that Jesus says here that are so valuable for our relationships together in the body, and with how we behave in those relationships. It all was prompted, this whole lesson that Jesus teaches here, was prompted by a question that the disciples asked about greatness. They said, "Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And there is something behind that question, right? I mean, the Jesus' reply is an indication that they've got kingdom all wrong. That when they think about kingdom, that they're thinking about power, and they're thinking about the authority. They're thinking about a king in royal robes, and they're thinking about if there is a royal king, then he also has royal emissaries, those that are on his right and on his left. And they see themselves, because of their closeness to him, as being the ones who are going to be his right hand and his left hand men in the kingdom. And so when they're asking about greatness, they're asking about what's the path up for us? How do we keep moving up? And so they're wanting to know what that path looks like. And what Jesus says in response is that the road into greatness is not a road upward; it's a road downward. If you're going to be great in the kingdom, then here's what you need to be like. And he brings a child, and he says that until you learn to be like this, till you learn to be like little Omar sleeping on Jennifer's lap, until you learn a kind of humility in terms of your dependency on God, until you learn a kind of humility when it comes to relationships with others, until you see yourself not as big, but until you see yourself as small, then you're not really ready for. You can't even. In fact, he says you can't even get into the kingdom. If you're going to enter the kingdom, you have to have a heart like a child. And so he teaches them that object lesson by making that point. He says some things to them about being careful about their influence. He says that I need to be really vigilant about how my words and about how my behavior affect other people. In fact, he says that it's so critical that if I cause someone who has a little faith, someone who's a small person, to lose their way, then it would be a lot better if Flynn put me in his fishing boat and took me out and tied a big brick around my neck and kicked me off the front of the boat. It'd be a lot better, he says, that if a man, than to cause one to stumble, if a millstone were hung around my neck and I were drowned in the depth of the sea. And so it says something there about how I need to value my influence and how I need to value other people and how I affect other people, how I affect their souls. And that's a part of greatness in the kingdom, is that souls matter to me the way that they matter to God. People matter to me the way that they matter to God. And so I see the worth in them. And I prize the worth and the value of other people more than I prize my own esteem or my own prestige or my own greatness. I'm willing to swallow that because I care for people the way that he cares for people. He says to us that we also need to be mindful of not only how our influence affects other people, but how their influence then impacts us. And so he talks there about how if there is something in my life that causes me to stumble, that I need to be I need to care so much about God and my relationship with him that I will eradicate whatever that is. If it means even making myself disabled in some way or handicapped in some way. I'll cut off the hand, I'll cut off the foot, I'll pluck out the eye, and even make myself limited because I value my relationship with God more than anything else. That's another measure of greatness. My relationship with God matters more than my personal liberties and my personal rights and my personal abilities, so that I will handicap myself for God's sake if it means that I own Him and that He owns me. And so He keeps telling us about what greatness in the kingdom looks like. And it's not the picture that people normally think about when they think about being great, as he kind of describes these things. He comes back to the value of souls. And he describes for us that another aspect of greatness in the kingdom is that we who are God's people have a search and rescue kind of heart and mindset. God found us when we were sheep that were straying, when we were wandering in the hills, when we were lost in the wood, when we were in the clutches of the wolf. God rescued us. And that feat of God's grace has an impact now on our hearts, so that what Jesus is creating, the greatness that He wants to be an aspect of His people, is that they have that same kind of mission now. That because we've been rescued, we have a search and rescue kind of mindset. And so he says in verse 12, "What do you think if any man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray? Does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go searching for the one that's straying?" A shepherd loves his sheep. He loves every one of them. And if one is gone, if one is in a predicament, then he will leave the fold and he'll go hunt for the one and put himself at risk until he can bring it back and put it back in the fold again. And so the heart that he's describing there, he's teaching us another lesson about greatness. This is what greatness looks like. Greatness is when you put, when you inconvenience yourself because there is someone who's wandering that needs to come home, because there's someone that's lost that needs to be found, because there's someone who has gotten themselves into the mire and they need somebody to come and pull them out of the quicksand. And so greatness is the heart of a people who feel the way the shepherd does about that, and who go and reclaim the sheep that's lost. And when he finds it, he rejoices over it more than the 99 which had not gone astray. Thus it's not the will of your Father who's in heaven that one of these little ones perish. So we learn in that kind of search and rescue exploit. We learn something about the heart of God in that. Then he says in verse 15, he talks some more about this whole matter of how we protect each other and how we honor our relationships, and how we, when love requires and when the need of a soul demands, we even confront. Read with me, if you would, in verse 15 of Matthew chapter 18, when Jesus says, "And if your brother sins, go and reprove him in private. And if he listens to you, you've won your brother. But if he does not listen to you, take one or two more with you, so that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every fact may be confirmed. And if he refuses to listen to them, then tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and as a tax gatherer. Truly I say to you, whatever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And again I say to you that if 2 of you agree on earth about anything that they may ask, it shall be done for them by my Father who is in heaven. For where 2 or 3 have gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst." Before we delve into the wisdom that Jesus gives here about how we reconcile and about how we confront, I want to again set this in the great context. Sometimes, particularly the last verse of this text where Jesus says, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst," sometimes I'm afraid that gets kind of lifted from the context to say something that's correct, but to say something that unfortunately, when we come to this context, robs it of part of the punch here. Jesus is not saying that he's not just giving assurance to small churches, or he's not just saying that if there's just 2 or 3 of you together doing something spiritual, that you have His presence with you. Now that's all true. But what he's giving here is a sense of confidence and a sense of assurance and of God with us when we are doing God's mission. Do you see that? He has just talked about me going and speaking to a brother who's in sin in order to try to rescue him, and of the measures, the steps that are made as he shows a heart that is penitent or is hardened in his sin, and he's saying that God is with us in that kind of mission when we have hearts that are looking to reconcile, when we have hearts that are looking to correct, when we have hearts that are looking to save, then he's promising that when 2 or 3 are doing that, when you're doing that all alone, that God is with you, that God is present, that God cares, and that He will bless that kind of effort. And so I just want us to appreciate in the context how important a search and rescue kind of mission is to us as a people. It's not the case with where I work now. But when Jen and I first married, I worked at the Knoxville 76, which is a truck stop at I-75 and Interstate 40 as you're making your way into Knoxville. If I decided to show up at the truck stop and sell fuel all day with fumes on my breath, nobody there would have said a word. If Jen and I were not married and we were just shacking up, and I was coming to work every day and I was doing my job and drinking a little beer on the side and fooling around, nobody there would have confronted me. And nobody would have said, man, the life that you're living, it could be so much better than that. And the girl that you're dating and that you're living with, I mean, she deserves better than that. She deserves a commitment. But among the people of God, I have people who love me so much, who care about me so much, who value my soul more than they value the social niceties, more than they value placating things and making it all good, more than they value whatever the norms are of our culture. I have a family of people that God has blessed me to be around me who won't let that go on. Who will say, Jason, what are you doing? Why are you living this way? Where is God in your life? And look at what that's doing to you. Now, we need to be jealous of that. That's a great gift to have a people that care enough about one another that we'll talk about those kinds of things, that we will address those kinds of matters. And when we don't behave that way, God is not among us. God is not with the 2 or 3 who are going to avoid the confrontation because it's just going to rock the boat. Because it's just going to be a little messy, or it's going to be awkward. God is with the people. He is blessing the people who care enough about souls that they'll come to each other about those kinds of breaches of fellowship, those things that put our souls in jeopardy, because there's a sheep that's lost his way, that's caught in the valley, that's stuck in the thicket, and somebody needs to go and get him unstuck. And so God has given that to us as a mission. God has given that to us as a one another responsibility. God has given that to us as a purpose. And that's a purpose that we need to embrace. One that we need to care about. And that we need to care about doing well and wisely. Because it's part of the measure of greatness in the kingdom. It's people that care enough to do that sort of thing. It's really not a humble heart that stands off. It's really not a humble heart that doesn't want to get involved. It really takes a measure of humility. It really takes a great care for souls that we get involved and that we try to reconcile and we try to fix things when things are awry. Now, that is very different from life at the truck stop. And not just the truck stop. It's a lot different from life in the office. It's a lot different from life if you work in fast food. It's a lot different than life if you work in a plant. It's a lot different than the life that you live in retail. I mean, that's just not very common. And that's the reason why it's so important, is because it's not common enough. And so it's the kind of heart that we need to have as a people. Now, let's talk for a moment about the wisdom and how we do that right. And some of the practical principles that Jesus gives us here about how we do that. How do we go and confront? How do we go and rescue someone whose soul is in jeopardy? What do I do when someone wrongs me? Whether that's in our family here or if it's in my biological family. The principles that Jesus talks about here are ones that really pertain to, it's a healthy way of behaving in all relationships when things are broken. And so he gives us he's speaking particularly about us. I want to make that clear. He's talking about his family. But I do want you to see that the principles apply. They are the wisest principles for how we deal with all relationships when reconciliation is needed. Number one, I want you to see that Jesus talks about how we make it face to face. He talks about how we make it face to face. If your brother sins, go and reprove him in private. I want to focus on the word go. Larry sins against me. Or Larry sins. Maybe not against me, he sins. Jesus said go. Now what does that mean? It means go, right? It means I get in the car. It means I get on the bike. It means I walk on the street. I mean, it means that I do all that I can to make this as personal and as present a conversation as it can be. Now, there may be times where it's got to be a phone call, or it may be times when the conversation or the exchange is not as personal as you would like for it to be, but as much as is possible, Jesus says, go. Now, I just want to say my behavior is different when it's face to face than when it's in a letter. Is yours? I mean, sometimes when you start writing a letter, you start saying stuff that and maybe it's read the wrong way, or maybe you start getting hot under the collar when you're writing the letter. But when it's face to face, then there can be qualifiers. Then I can tell if Flynn is starting to get agitated. Then I can tell if I've struck a nerve when Terry and I are talking. And I can restate that. I can tell when Jason's voice starts to raise that something needs to be done to kind of cool down the conversation again. Because in face-to-face, you see, we can read one another's body language. We can hear one another's voice. We can gauge how things are going in the conversation. And not only that, but when I make it face to face, do I show you respect in that? I certainly do. there's a lot more respect when I come and run the risk of feeling awkward when Dave and I are talking. When I run the risk of feeling nerves and of feeling anxiety and all of that sort of thing, then face to face shows respect to the person, because I've come to them rather than writing a letter, or rather than doing something else besides making it something that is the kind of face-to-face encounter that Jesus describes. Distance demonstrates doubt. Distance demonstrates distrust. So when I put myself in the room with the person whose soul I'm concerned about, or with whom I'm separated, then I've removed the barriers. I've removed the distance. And so the path to reconciliation is a much more hopeful one. And so the wisdom in what Jesus says when he says, go. Number 2, I want you to see how he says, if your brother sins, go and reprove him in private. Why does he say that? What's the significance of privacy? Well, there's a preventative that's a part of that, for one thing. For instance, it might be that there is a conflict, but the conflict is only perceived. And so the fact that we've kept it private means that there is an opportunity in that kind of situation to seek clarification. And so rather than just coming with both barrels blazing, there is an opportunity to ask questions and to get some clarification about what you saw, or about what you heard, or about what you're afraid of, and to express it with that kind of qualifier in place, so that there can be understanding. Because it may be that there wasn't really a sin. It may be that something happened that wasn't intended. And so the keeping it private allows for that kind of clarification. It also is an act of grace. If I come and I talk to Gary and I keep it private, and let's say that Gary is guilty of some egregious sin, do you see that when I've shown care for him by protecting his reputation, that the chances of a reconciliation are much greater? Because whether he deserves it or not, that I treat him graciously by keeping it private and by protecting his reputation, is an act of grace that increases the likelihood that a change will take place. And so greatness is caring enough about the reputation even of the offender. Jesus is talking about someone here who has sinned. And he says, I even need to protect the reputation of the offender so I go and I talk to them in private. I show them grace in that, because the chance of rescuing them is much greater if I handle it that way. It also shows, when I do that I value the relationship and I value the person, that I've protected their reputation. And so I'm much more to communicate to them love and care. I'm much more to communicate to them the fact that I really value them deeply when I protect their reputation and when I go and talk to them in private, than if I were to noise abroad the thing that I saw, or the thing that I heard, or the thing that has alienated our relationship. So I make it face to face, and secondly, I keep it private. Does that make sense? Thirdly, Jesus says that we make it safe. We make it safe. That's another implication from what we just read. He says, if your brother sins, go and reprove him in private. If he listens to you, you've won your brother. I just want to say, in connection with what we just said about keeping it private, that what we do when we go and we speak to him alone, or her alone, is that we build an environment that is conducive to candid, to kind, and to calm dialogue. Because the thing the great risk in a confrontation is high emotion, right? It's that we can't have reasoned discussion because because there is either great sadness and discouragement, or that there is great temper and outrage. And so part of what Jesus is describing here is an effort on our part that we take care to build an environment when we're confronting that is conducive to candid. That's part of the benefit in being private, is that we can really be candid with each other. We can say what needs to be said, but at the same time we can be kind, and we can help try to take the emotion out of it, and we can be calm. Because what we need is reasoned dialogue, not high emotion. And so Jesus is talking about a principle where I take care to build an environment that is safe. A fourth principle that I want you to see here that's connected to the one, really to all of them that we just mentioned, and that's this: how I think when I'm confronting. Think when, not whip. Think when, not whip. And so he says, when he describes the desired outcome, he says in verse 15, if your brother sins, go and reprove him in private. If he listens to you, if he listens, he says, you have won your brother. Now that's the aim. The aim is not to win the argument. The aim is not vindication. It's reconciliation. The aim is not coming out on top, greatness that way. The aim is coming out arm to arm. It's coming out brothers. It's coming out reconciled. It's winning him, not winning the argument. It's winning her, not being the winner in some kind of social way or in some kind of contest way. The objective is to win the relationship. It's to win the common good. It's not to win in some kind of status way. Now that can easily be lost. It can be lost in our truth conversations with our friends. I'm talking to a friend who differs with me on some kind of doctrinal point, and it's really easy to lose our way in the kind of fluidness that's a part of conversation, so that it's no longer about persuading him. It's about proving him wrong and proving me right. And so we really have to take care in how we converse and in how we relate, that we keep the objective in mind. What's really in our heart in this? Is it to win or is it to whip? Now that means that there's going to be a little awkwardness that's a part of confrontations, and a part of, we might stutter. We might have to backtrack and say it again. We might be a little embarrassed or red-faced. We might be shaking and very nervous. And I would say if you don't feel that way, then you might want to check your heart, because folks that like confrontation, that scares me a little bit. When you enjoy that, there's something that's not good about that. And if you do like it, then you really need to monitor where your heart goes in those kinds of environments or in those kinds of settings. But don't let all of those nervous things. There's something about that can communicate to someone the fact that we really care. We care enough to be all nerves in front of them. We care enough to be all tears. We care enough to be all flustered, because we value them and we value the relationship. And so it's a way of showing not weakness, but a way of showing strength. Because what we do is we expose our heart in that kind of exchange. Jesus says next that if the private meeting doesn't work, then he says we take a small, impartial peace party with us. Look at what he says next. He says, if he does not listen to you, verse 16, take one or two more with you, so that by the mouth of two or three witnesses, every fact may be confirmed. He says that we take a small, 2 or 3 witnesses. That's the impartial part. We take a small, impartial. I don't take my buddies with me. Do you get that? The point is not to bring allies who will, together with me, provide overwhelming force on the person that I'm looking to convince. When I bring witnesses, we're talking about witnesses like to a crime. They are people who are objective, right? They are people who are telling what they saw and what they heard. And so when I'm bringing 2 or 3 witnesses, the point again is not to whip, it's to win. It's to convict the heart of the person that we're trying to rescue. And so we bring a small so that they're not overwhelmed, impartial so that they know that this is not a ganging up, but that they understand again that they're valued. And so someone impartial is brought in, a small impartial peace party. Their intentions, like our intentions, are the intentions of rescuing. And so they're not allies, but they're objective, impartial witnesses who will hear us both. The point of the conversation is to illuminate, to shed light. It's not to isolate. It's not to alienate. It's not to eliminate. It is to illuminate, to bring more light into the situation so that a soul can be rescued. He says that if the impartial peace party doesn't work, he says then you involve the people who care. You involve the people who care. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. Now, see the importance of that. The reason for telling it to the church is not to humiliate. The reason for telling it to the church is it's not all punitive. There is a punitive element that's a part of that. But the reason for telling it to the church is to leverage more of God's heart and of God's power in rescuing the soul that's in jeopardy. And so you tell it to the church because you're telling it to the people that care. You're sharing it with family. You're sharing it with the folks who will pray. You're sharing it with the people who will pursue. You're sharing it with the people who are the difference makers, who ought to be the difference makers in that person's life. And so he says you tell it to them. And so you involve the people who care. And then finally he says that if that doesn't work, then what you have to do is to protect the public good. You have to protect the welfare of the community. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and as a tax collector. There comes a time when someone becomes a menace to the health of the community. When someone becomes a hurt to the reputation of the group. When someone, because of their life or because of their character, says something about the Lord and about His people that we can't have communicated. And so there has to be some kind of action that's taken in order to say that we don't endorse this kind of life. We love this person. We love them to our own hurt. But they're not one of us anymore. They're not living like God. They're not showing His heart. They're not showing His character. That doesn't eliminate the care for their soul, because Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners. I mean, He was all about rescuing tax collectors and sinners. So we still care about the soul of the person. But there is an action that's taken in order that the public good, in order that the welfare of the community can be protected. There's a time when you might have to fire the guy that just won't listen. There's a time when it might be that someone has to be kicked out of the house because they're hurting the family. There's a time when friendships have to end. There's a time when even the ties that bind us together as believers are broken. Not of our own will, but because of a heart that has just been deceived and has been captivated by Satan, willingly so, who doesn't want to come home. You can't drag the sheep back. There's got to be some compliance, some desire to be back in the fold again. And so he says there comes a time when you must protect the public good. Could I say to you that this method of conflict resolution is contrary to the fight or flight impulse that we feel? It's contrary to the silence or violence tendency that often goes on when we're in conflict. But it's part of what makes it work is that it's disarming, because it is unexpected, because it is uncommon. It's disarming, and the risk of it makes it work. The risk of it makes it work. Peacemakers are heaven's agents. Peacemakers have God's power and approval. Peacemakers have God's hand and they find His presence. And Jesus is giving us the mandate in this passage that we as a people all be people that make for peace. We protect our ties. We look out for one another's souls. We look out for those that are straying and we seek to bring them home. And we practice the practical, the difficult, but the practical wisdom that works. God saw us in our sin, and He didn't just sit up in heaven. He came here. He came among us to confront us with our sin. And we killed Him when He came. But He came and He let us hurt Him. He let us spit on Him. He let us mock Him. He let us make Him carry our cross. He let us make Him die in our place. And He voluntarily gave that because He wanted not to whip us, but because He wanted to win us. And so He calls on us to be that kind of people with each other and with those that need rescue. Where are you in your walk with Jesus today? How's your heart? How's your standing with Him? If you need to come home, or if you need to come to Him because you've not yet rendered obedience to Him as His child, then why not do that now as together we stand and as we sing.